and welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. So there is a term out there that has been thrown around here and there and everywhere over the past few years, and that term is the term woke, W-O-K-E. Some people consider it to be a form of enlightenment where you're able to see around you and you're able to perceive the injustices in the world that surround you in ways that you weren't able to do before. So you were asleep to it and now you're woke to it. But there are other people who consider woke to be a really dangerous thing for America, a way to kind of create a culture kind of battle of some kind that, or culture politics of some kind that actually take the eye off the ball of what's important. But you know, this word woke is actually an example of something much bigger, and it sits within that bigger framework quite neatly. It's also a term that many of us are familiar with. So I want to talk about this term woke in light of the bigger picture. So let's see how I do in this respect. I've got all my research all gathered up, and let's talk woke. So the first question is, where did the term woke come from? Anyway, actually, it's been around for nearly 100 years. The term woke originates from African American slang that was used as far back as the early 1930s to describe the sensation that a person might be feeling when they become alert to racial prejudice and discrimination that's happening around them, or which might be affecting them personally. Over the course of decades after that, the term woke evolved and broadened. It became more generalized, and in the current day, it tends to relate to becoming aware of the social inequities that are prevalent in society, which might target or suppress or marginalize people based on their gender, their sexuality, or their ethnic identity. The woke phenomenon originated in the US all those decades ago because the 1930s was a time of the Great Depression. And when times are tough, often humans start looking after themselves. And when they do that, the strongest or more privileged tend to do better than those who might need a bit more of a hand in order to survive or to become equalized. But it's not the 1930s anymore, and overall, Western societies have prospered since then. The quality of life of all people in the Western world has on average gone up. But the concept of woke has been spreading further and further around the Western world. In fact, since all of those decades ago, nearly 100 years ago, during the Great Depression, when woke first became a slang word to describe racism of a specific group of people, it has now spread globally. And these days, it's a concept that has influenced a broad spectrum of social movements and political discussions. Woke is something that challenges the establishment. So it challenges established norms. It questions the existing societal structures, and it promotes inclusivity. Basically, woke has become a term that has been adopted by activists worldwide who might want to highlight the many social systems that may be biased against certain people, and who want to advocate social justice. And yes, woke is also a concept that is very strongly opposed by certain political groups. In America, the conservative movement, because it directly challenges tradition. And tradition is all about status quo. So think of it this way. How many times has your family followed a tradition? Maybe it's something like waking up late on Christmas Day and opening presents all together over a boozy, eggnoggy kind of a breakfast. Or maybe it's something like always spending Thursday nights at the bowling alley or Wednesdays at book club, something like that. Or always taking your dog for a walk before dinner. These are all traditions, and they're all established norms or established routines. And yes, it can be a little bit uncomfortable to challenge an established routine. Suddenly, things become uncertain. I mean, if everyone opens their presents early on Christmas morning and I'm the only one who sleeps in, then I might miss out on all the fun, right? That's one tradition ruined. And if I don't walk my dog until after dinner, I might be feeling too full and lazy to really go for a walk at all, which means that's another tradition ruined. People love routines. They love tradition. They feel safe inside those routines. And so routines often do become traditions. And some people have been living in traditions for years, decades, generations even. And woke is a massive threat to the routines and traditions because the whole point of woke is to identify that some of these routines and traditions are hurting people by excluding them from the very thing that the people inside the tradition are able to enjoy without restriction. So woke is a very polarizing thing. The people who criticize woke say that it stifles free speech and that it promotes cancel culture and that it undermines traditional institutions, some of which have stood for so long that losing those institutions represents a risk to the stability of the entire society. But woke is also just a word. But it's a word that has been weaponized by some political groups to criticize progressive movements. And some people within those progressive movements believe that this weaponization of woke has blown it way out of proportion and is increasing the divisions within society, and that these increasing divisions within society are what represent the biggest risk to the stability of the society. So, both sides of the argument believe that the topic of woke is a dangerous risk to society for different reasons, but they still land in exactly the same place in the end. So congratulations. It seems as though, regardless of your position on woke, you all have something in common, and that is the for or the against could be a danger to your society. But you know what woke really is? Woke is a vernacular term that means being aware of something, the kind of awareness that you have when you have knowledge of something. Woke is awareness, and awareness is knowledge, and knowledge comes from the intellectual aspects of the brain. The brain function that creates intellect primarily involves the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. The cerebrum is responsible for higher brain functions, including thoughts, actions, emotions, and the interpretation of sensory data. The cerebrum makes it possible for a person to think or plan or read or hold memories and process their emotions. It doesn't produce the emotions, but it helps them to process those emotions. And so when you look at woke from the perspective of woke being awareness, and awareness meaning knowledge, and knowledge coming from the intellect, and the intellect being a brain function that allows a person to operate in a very basic way like reading and remembering stuff, or just plain thinking, well, suddenly woke doesn't sound very scary at all. It just sounds like an ordinary human function, a bit like breathing. So if an ordinary human function like intellect is causing so much controversy, is it really the human function that's the problem, or could it be something else? And why does all of this information about woke and woke culture and the woke agenda and wokeism and wokeocracy and all the different terms that have been used, how does that relate to human ascension? Because I'm going to tell you now, it really does. It really, really, really does. What I love about this show is that it allows me to see and to demonstrate to you just how many things that are part of our ascension as a human race also relate to our everyday existence. And from time to time, some of those things are going to surprise you. So let's take a look a little bit deeper, okay? You know I love to go deep. So give me a rabbit hole to dig any day of the week. Okay, so the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines intellect to be the capacity for knowledge and rational or intelligent thought. Intellectual freedom, on the other hand, is the freedom to think about anything that you want. And intellectualism is when a person is committed to developing their intellect. The term woke falls within the category of intellectual freedom. Woke occurs when a person has been given the freedom to think about anything they want, and their natural process of thinking has brought them to an awareness of something occurring that they interpret to be unfair or unjust. The more intellect the person has, the more their natural ability to think and achieve rational or intelligent interpretations of what they're thinking about increases. And so the more intellectual freedom a person has, the more likely that when they come across a thought process that generates wokeness, their intellectualism will have developed into a rational and intelligent interpretation of what they've encountered. And so that brings me to another word and its definition, and the word is anti-intellectualism. Now, anti-intellectualism is defined as opposition and hostility towards intellect, intellectual freedom, and intellectualism. It's when a person doesn't approve of or tries to suppress or strongly criticizes free thinking and the development of rational thought or intelligence. So here's something you may have actually studied in school, and you may be aware of it. If you've ever read the book 1984 by George Orwell, you will be very familiar with the concept of anti-intellectualism. 1984 is a story about a dystopian city of London that's been taken over by a dark governing force that engages a kind of a militarized system of population control that polices the thought processes of its citizens. The government has reduced the number of words that are permitted to be used in the English language by destroying books and rewriting the dictionary in order to avoid people from being able to form intelligent sentences that might spark rational thinking or intellectual thinking. And people who are suspected of rational thought or of thinking freely are actually punished, and some of them are even killed. The book is excellent, but I'm going to warn you now about seeing the play. I made the mistake when I was living in England of going to see the play, and I travelled to the beautiful, glorious city of Bath to watch a small local production. Naive as I was, I somehow thought that it might be a nice way to spend the weekend. But the play was acted so convincingly, and the story is about something so evil and vile that it ruined my entire stay in Bath, and I still get this kind of guttural sense of fear or dread every time I think about that play. When you see, I think it was also that I was only like 2 people away from the stage too. When you see the humanized effect of a gradual decline in intellect playing out, the growth and infestation of ignorance, the brutality of suppression of a natural human brain function, and the suffering that a person feels when they know that something isn't right, but their thoughts are being policed, and so they end up in a constant, increasingly traumatic struggle against their own thoughts. Have you ever had, for example, a deep, dark secret that you knew you could never tell anyone? Imagine if your secret was so bad that you weren't even able to tell yourself. Imagine living with that secret deep inside you, and a rabid, invasive, cruel, and inhumane policing system is monitoring your every waking and sleeping moment, just waiting for you to make a mistake and to reveal your hidden secret. Meanwhile, it's bubbling to the surface all day and all night, and you're having more and more trouble suppressing it, because it's the truth. And just the fact that you know that it's the truth means you must be thinking about it. But thinking about it will lead to the most horrendous torture imaginable. Yes, the book is great. 1984 is a great book, but consider this your warning. Don't go and see the play. It's been around 20 years since I went to see it, and I still remember it like it was yesterday, and it still haunts me whenever I think about it. So anti-intellectualism is the concept described in that shocking detail in George Orwell's 1984 book. However, one of the reasons why Orwell's book is still so revered around the world, despite having been first published nearly 80 years ago, is because it was prophetic. The book predicts the future by predicting the slow decline of humanity through the depreciation of education, philosophy, art, literature, history, and science. All of the very things that anti-intellectualism manifests once it begins to take over society. So anti-intellectualism is something that often coincides with intellectualism. They never really live in harmony, but they do often live together. After all, there are always going to be two sides to every story. Well, I actually think that they like to say that there's always three sides to every story. I think there's your side and my side, and then the truth that sits somewhere in the middle. And I guess it's the same when it comes to the battle over intellectualism. Intellectualism is something that occurs naturally because the brain will naturally learn and develop itself the more that it's used. Just like when you go to the gym, and if you go every day, your muscles will get stronger and stronger. And if you stretch your muscles every day, then they will become more and more flexible over time as well. Well, the brain works the same way. The more you're able to think freely, the more you will naturally think. The direction of your thinking could go anywhere, like with the flexibility of your muscles, because your ability to think isn't restricted. And so it is inevitable that as your thinking continues, you will learn more, which will make you stronger, just like your muscles getting stronger. You'll be exposed to new and different thoughts, and you'll develop more rational insight and become more and more intelligent, just like you're building your muscles. There are, of course, things that can get in the way, though, like isolation from new experiences that will prevent you from knowing new things to think about. But for the purposes of today's episode, we're looking at intellect as something that could be completely unrestricted by rules or geography or opportunity. When intellectualism is able to develop without restrictions, it has possibilities that are infinite in nature. We currently, after all, only use around 5% of our brains. And who knows, maybe that's because our style of society is limiting our ability to develop the intellect that opens up more brain power. That is a subject that I'll look into in a future episode, I think. But it's worth mentioning. Anti-intellectualism, however, is when the natural development of the power of the brain's ability to reason, find rationale, and become more intelligent is suppressed. And generally, proponents of anti-intellectualism are opposed to intellect, but they approve of emotions or feelings. They argue that emotions and feelings should guide one's thinking, not intellect, because emotions and feelings come from an entirely different human function and do not arise from intellect. In the United States, anti-intellectualism can be traced back to the 18th century, and in particular a religious revival movement called the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening occurred in the American colonies in around the 1730s and 40s. The movement encouraged a renewed emphasis on spiritual devotion, individualism, and religious freedom. It also challenged the established religious order by promoting the idea that people could have a personal connection to God rather than having to rely on clergy or other religious representatives for their spiritual guidance. The First Great Awakening led to a growth of new Protestant denominations, including Methodist and Baptist, sort of sub-religions. It also led to the establishment of revival-based educational institutions, some of which exist today. For example, Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, and Rutgers universities all came from that movement, that First Great Awakening. But also, the First Great Awakening was a movement that fostered a sense of shared identity among the American colonists, which later influenced the ideals that led to the American Revolution. And that's the thing that links the First Great Awakening to anti-intellectualism. Because you see, the whole idea behind the American Revolution was this idea of populism, otherwise known as the rise of the ordinary people, against what was often portrayed to be the elite intellectuals, you see, who were detached from the working classes. So to cut to the chase, the populism movement and the American Revolution allowed the colonists to harness their emotions and their feelings in opposition to the perceptions of an oppressive, rational, intellectualized group of elites. It made sense back then, but does it make sense now? So let me give you another example of how anti-intellectualism has been used with respect to the ordinary people. We've heard about the American Revolution, in which this anti-intellectualism movement or populism movement of anti-intellectualism gave rise to the ordinary people. Okay. In contrast, the Spanish Civil War took place around 200 years after the American Revolution, somewhere between 1936 and 1939. During the war, the dictatorship that followed had anti-intellectualism as its core, and it was used as a significant tool against the Spanish people. General Francisco Franco, who went on to become Spain's dictator, enacted a form of repression which was called the White Terror against 200,000 citizens who were labelled with the title of being intelligentsia, I think it was. They included teachers, academics, artists, writers, and anyone who was politically active or spoke against Franco's army or his subsequent regime. The White Terror repression tactic was aimed at eliminating potential dissent, suppressing free thought or cultural and intellectual expression. For the 10 years that General Francisco Franco was in control of the Spanish army, it was a crime to think freely in Spain. And that was less than 100 years ago. In fact, it occurred at pretty much the same time that the term woke first came onto the scene. So let's have a look at another example, even more recent. Another example of anti-intellectualism being used against the people of a country occurred in Cambodia in around 1975, just 50 years ago. The Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia was led by a man called Pol Pot between 1975 and 1979. During this time, the regime employed extreme anti-intellectualism as a tool of repression and control. Firstly, the regime systematically targeted and eliminated people who were considered to be intellectual. And so this included academics, teachers, doctors, and anyone who was perceived to be educated. But even people who wore eyeglasses were targeted because it was believed that they must wear glasses because they read a lot of books. And so they were targeted. Schools and universities were closed and books were destroyed. The regime made efforts to eliminate all forms of education and any kind of intellectual pursuit, treating those things as though they were threats against its ideology. It also forced people who lived in cities to relocate to rural areas and work in agricultural labour camps. The regime started a campaign to relocate and re-educate through hard labour and indoctrination, which stripped people of their previous identities and their knowledge. But the regime didn't only target city folk. It also took farms away from rural landowners and put those owners to work as forced labour on what had once been their own land, subject to the same indoctrination as the people that had been taken from the cities. The regime also made it unlawful to speak a foreign language, in particular French, and what had previously been an innocent pastime like reading a novel, for example, was considered during the regime's rule to be a capital offence. Imagine that. Imagine living somewhere where just reading the latest Harry Potter book could get you the death penalty. And finally, the regime also sought to destroy the basic family structure, and it outlawed the expression of individual thought and instead promoted a collective identity that aligned to the regime's ideology. The Khmer Rouge anti-intellectualism terrorism over its people was part of a broader policy of genocide and repression that led to the deaths of an estimated 2 million plus Cambodians. And just on a personal side note about this, let me just add my 2 cents about it. Why not? When I hear people in Western societies complain that migrants from places like Cambodia are ruining their country, and then those same people complain about intellectualism or woke culture, it's like they're willing themselves into becoming the next Cambodian-style refugee. And because they're so opposed to free thinking and intellectualism, they don't even know that they're on their own way to becoming the next refugee. So we've talked about woke and how woke is part of the intellectual development of humanity, and how movements to squash or suppress intellect were originally derived from a passion to worship God in a more personalized way and to escape elitist control. But then later, of course, like most things, it becomes bastardized and it becomes weaponized and turned into what sounds like a populist movement, but actually it's not. It's an anti-population control mechanism instead. We've talked about 2 countries in the world that as recently as 50 years ago demonstrate just how dangerous preventing free thought is, and how this risk was even predicted in literature as much as 80 years ago by an innocent book by George Orwell called 1984, although I probably would say he wasn't quite so innocent. And yet, anti-intellectualism has been growing around the world right now. And the reason why is because it grows within people who aren't thinking freely. So if they aren't thinking freely, it becomes easier and easier to control their thinking in a variety of different ways. Anti-intellectualism is not confined to any single region or culture. It has been observed in various forms across the world. In some parts of the world, it's being used as a tool by authoritarian regimes to maintain control and suppress opposition, like in Russia, for example, where a person can be arrested and put in prison simply for holding up a blank sheet of paper in the town square. That blank sign is understood to carry an implied message of dissent, and so it's unlawful. Right now, at this moment in time, anti-intellectualism is also being observed in the United States and is linked to religious anti-rationalism, populist anti-elitism, and unreflective instrumentalism. So what exactly are those 3 things? What do they mean? So firstly, religious anti-rationalism is a belief that reason or logic should be disregarded if it interferes with a person's faith. The concept is based on the religious belief that God's truths cannot be fully understood or justified through rational thinking. And so if there is a conflict between faith and rationale, then the faith must preside over the rationale. It can go further as well and determine that if evidence against faith can be found, then the evidence must be disregarded. Or in some cases, the evidence should be considered to be against the will of God, even satanic in nature. Now, the second one, populist anti-elitism, is the belief that ordinary people, generally made up of lower or middle income earners of lower educational attainment, are, in quotes, pure, and that elites, generally made up of higher income earners or higher educational attainment, are, and I quote, evil and corrupt. Populist anti-elitism is generally anti-establishment in nature, with a focus on reversing the fortunes so that the rich and privileged become poor and downtrodden, and the poor or downtrodden become rich and privileged. Before we get too excited, though, you should also know that populist anti-elitism occurs on all sides of the political spectrum. In the US, the left tends to focus its populism in areas relating to socio-economic grievances like wages or access to healthcare. And then on the right tends to focus its populism in areas relating to societal cultural grievances like immigration, for example. Either way, the concept is the same. Populist anti-elitism is about the perception that some have it easier and better than others, and that those who have it better are inside a corrupt system, while those who don't are forced to be outside of the corrupt system. And then finally, the third thing, unreflective instrumentalism is the key ingredient needed when it comes to anti-intellectualism, because unreflective instrumentalism is what holds everything together and makes anti-intellectualism such an attractive method of population control in American society today. So what exactly is unreflective instrumentalism then? Because it really is very key to today's society. Okay, so even if you forget the rest of what you're hearing today, make sure you remember this little bit, because once you remember it, you will never look at your favorite podcaster, YouTuber, or radio talking head the same way ever again. Because for many of these people, the curtain will suddenly be pulled aside and they will be exposed for who they really are. Are you ready? All right. So unreflective instrumentalism is a belief that becoming educated or a theoretical expert in the field of anything is a waste of time, because the only thing that means anything is money. So why waste time learning when you can just jump right on in and hustle instead? Half of the people, actually, you know what, I'm being kind. What I really should be saying is that most of the people that you're currently listening to on the radio, on YouTube, and on podcast forums, most of them are hustling. They don't really have a deep and multifaceted understanding of what they're talking about. But they talk about it because when they do, you listen, and then they get paid. And this is a phenomenon that has developed very recently all over the world. But more than anywhere else, it's developed in massive proportions in the United States. And I think that one of the reasons why it's so prevalent in the US is because of that capitalist monetary focus of the society, where money talks basically, and where there's opportunities to be heard in the country as well. Because like everywhere else, where there's opportunities, there's going to be opportunistic kind of behavior. So here's a typical example that I'm sure you've come across in your lifetime. You have a friend, for example, who's dropped out of school when he was 15. He might have been smart and witty and quick to learn new tricks, or maybe he was even super funny and very entertaining, but he just couldn't be bothered finishing school. And when you ask him why, well, his response is that all that book learning is a waste of time. He's too busy making money to bother with that boring crap, you know? That guy is the poster child for unreflective instrumentalism. He jumped straight to the finish line without bothering to run the marathon. And sometimes it works, which is the reason why people do it. And sometimes it gets him in trouble. Okay, so for example, let's just say that he quit school at 15, hustles his way into enough money to put rent down on a food truck. And he starts selling hot dogs on the street corner. He's killing it, making a fortune, because he's found the busiest, hungriest, hot dog hungry area, hungriest corner in town, okay? Who needs an education to sell hot dogs, right? Right? So in scenario one, he's done himself a favor by not bothering to finish school or learn the hospitality trade. He just leaves school at 15, gets a truck and starts selling and making money. But in scenario two, his habit of hustling means that he often cuts corners. And one day he doesn't bother to cook the hot dogs enough, or he stores them wrong, or he doesn't maintain his fridges right, or he takes some other kind of shortcut and accidentally poisons somebody, and that person reports him to the health department, and the health department shuts him down. He loses his truck, He loses his livelihood, and so eventually he loses his place to live. And because he cuts corners, he ends up doing something else dodgy to compensate, which results in him getting arrested and spending a few months in the lockup. All because he didn't bother to learn the rules for heating and serving food, or didn't buy his food license, or, whatever else he couldn't be bothered doing to pay his dues before he could really become a bona fide hot dog seller. Basically, unreflective instrumentalism is when you disregard the value that knowledge and theoretical know-how can bring to a situation, and instead you just focus on doing whatever it takes to make it happen. When you mix religious anti-rationalism and populist anti-elitism and unreflective instrumentalism together, you end up with a specific type of anti-intellectualism that denies science, denies critical thinking, and denies expert opinions. This kind of anti-intellectualism is where misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories and the erosion of society thrives. Now, earlier in today's episode, I mentioned that anti-intellectualism is a method of population control, and I used examples from Spain and Cambodia to illustrate how it can be used by authoritarian regimes to control a population by force. But America includes an example of how anti-intellectualism is being used to control the population by manipulating people's feelings so that they believe that they're pushing for a better life for themselves, when in fact they're pushing for a greater hardship for themselves. So we've all become very acquainted with the term woke. So let's return to that for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, woke culture emphasizes social justice and the awareness of systematic inequalities. For many Christians in the US, particularly inside the evangelical communities, the term woke may not be the word that's being used, but what will be used is wording that aligns the biblical messages relating to justice and compassion. Because the Bible, in particular the New Testament, carries many guiding principles when it comes to justice and compassion, particularly when it comes to compassion. So let's take a look at one of those messages about compassion that appears in the New Testament. In Matthew 25, 35 to 40, Jesus speaks about the importance of showing compassion and kindness to others. So this is what the passages say. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing of clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. What these passages talk about, which is fundamental to the evangelical faith, is the importance of carrying out compassionate actions and how they're seen as acts of kindness towards Jesus himself, even if they're directed towards other people, because they are carried out towards people who are outcasts and in need of return into the fold of kindness. Christians who actually read the Bible, because there are those who do, the ones that study the Word of God, will have read that passage probably over and over again until they've understood it for what it really means to say. But there is another side of the evangelical community that has resorted to the easy fix principle of unreflective instrumentalism. You see, I was getting to a point. Instead of actually studying the Word of God in their Bible, they have jumped to whatever passage works for them, and they have disregarded anything that doesn't work for them because they pursue the quick fix solution, just like the dodgy hot dog food truck guy. And so what happens in this scenario is that they hear the word woke and they completely ignore one of the most important messages of the Bible's New Testament relating to compassion. And instead they fight for the opposite, which actually takes them further away rather than closer to their faith. It's a step backwards, away from ascension, away from closeness to God as it's perceived by religious faith. And it's done in the name of God by people who are striving to be at one with God. And then, of course, it becomes a polarizing topic with many of these Christians sort of viewing it as a threat to their traditional values and religious beliefs, even though the person who was conducting themselves in a manner that directly threatens their traditional value and religious belief was the Christian themselves, not the stranger in need. I mean, I'm not a Christian, okay? I don't know what I am, to be honest. I'm just a person who wants to understand the reality that I'm surrounded by in the best way that I can. I believe that science has figured out a lot of things. I also believe that science is a bit blinkered and it chooses to disregard anything that it can't see. And I believe that just because we can't see something or prove that it exists doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I don't believe in God, but I also don't not believe in God. I do believe, however, that there is much more than what we know. And I am open to finding out more, and I'm respectful of anyone who believes that they have the answer, whether they attain that answer through science or through faith. But what I find to be highly hypocritical is when a person claims to be a Christian but then completely ignores the messages of Christianity. And the one that I've quoted from Matthew is a really easy to understand one. All you need to do is read it or hear the words spoken and you'll understand it. But this is what anti-intellectualism does. This is why it destroys societies. It encourages the population to avoid learning. And when the brains of people are devoid of direct learning, there's a whole bunch of empty space there inside their brain that can be injected with a whole bunch of nonsense. So what happens is that the population gets told what to think, and because they're being encouraged to rely on their feelings, those feelings can be very easily manipulated. So think about the typical chick flick at the movies that you may have seen, if you're so inclined. Something like, Love Actually, or your average movie where Julia Roberts is the star of the show. There will always be a certain kind of music that plays at just about the right time in the story. And the purpose of the music is to give you a delightfully warm and comforting sense that these two lead actors are actually characters in the movie who truly love each other. Or think about that TV show Friends, for example, that ran for 10 years, and the intro music that was played at the start of every episode. I bet that whenever you hear that song playing, it immediately makes you feel happy about when you were in your 20s and hanging out with all your friends. And what about that theme music to the movie Jaws, for example? Every time you hear the music of Jaws or of the movie Psycho or something, you might start to feel uneasy, and you may be imagining what it might be if you were swimming on the beach and were approached by a shark, or staying in a hotel room with a funny kind of hotel superintendent or something. I think if you're out on the beach swimming in the sea and you heard that music playing, the one from Jaws, you'd come scrambling back to the shore as soon as possible, because the music would tickle that feeling of insecurity and maybe even fear of being eaten by a shark. Things like that can be very persuasive. Well, the word woke has been turned into the same kind of thing. It's created a feeling in some people which is based on the empty space inside the brain caused by anti-intellectualism. If somebody wants your vote, all they have to do is repeat the word woke, woke, woke a few times, a bit like Beetlejuice, and then declare themselves to be anti-woke or dedicated to eradicating wokeism, or, woke or something. Because if you might be listening to them with your feelings rather than your intellect, you may not realize that what they actually mean when they say anti-wokeism is anti-Christian compassion. That kind of Christian compassion that's described in Matthew 25, verses 35 to 40. If someone stood up at the podium and said to you directly and honestly, I promise to destroy everything in society that follows the teaching of Christ in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 35 to 40, would you vote for them? I mean, I really doubt that any Christian would go home and explain to their partner, their friends, their children, or even to random people in the street that they voted for a candidate because he or she promised to destroy the elements of society that just so happen to follow the teachings of Christ. But that is exactly what anti-intellectualism is. It's a phenomenon in society that convinces people that being educated or directly knowledgeable about a subject is wrong or unnecessary or evil. And so the people instead rely on their feelings and their emotions, which are very easy things to manipulate with words and music and lots of other kinds of little tricks. So here's a very quick example of a trick of manipulation. It's really simple. You look lovely today. Can you do me a favor? That's it. You give someone a compliment, you let them stew in that for a second so that they feel good about themselves and they feel good about you, and then you get them to do something for you. Because actually the only reason why you spoke to them at all is because you wanted them to do something for you. You don't really care how they look. You barely even looked at them. But if you need to give them a compliment in order to get what you want, in order to get their attention and their compliance, then so be it. That's it. Obviously, this is a very simplified example, but things like that happen all day long in politics, for example, and in the media, and at schools, and in churches, and in the workplace, and in advertising, and in relationships, and in marriages, and in friendships. And I could just go on and on and on. Generally, the way that it works is that the intellectual is the person who's really in charge, regardless of what they say. The person who is not intellectual is being manipulated into believing something because of their feelings. But their feelings have been harnessed. The feelings have been manipulated by the intellectual. And generally the most dangerous and most manipulative intellectual is the person who pretends to be anti-intellectual. Today's episode is not about religion or faith, even though I've used faith as an example. It's also not about politics, even though, the anti-intellectualism kind of tool is a political weapon commonly used in politics. It changes sides from generation to generation. I mean, currently it's a tool being used on the right to keep voters uninformed and focused on their emotions. But quite a few decades ago, it was being used by the left in very similar ways. As it happens, the left currently includes more intellectuals than the right, and so the scales have tipped over. But with time, I'm sure the balance will shift and the opposite will be true, because that's how politics works. But today's episode is not about politics, as I said. It's about human evolution, just like every other episode. And if you recall a few weeks ago, I talked about human ascension and what it really is and what the steps are to becoming more ascendant so that humanity can raise its collective consciousness and tip the scales into a new fifth dimensional reality. Well, step one in that process was awareness. And you can't become aware by having something spoon-fed to you. You could only really raise your awareness by putting in the hard work yourself. Being intellectual or woke is about being aware of what's happening in your reality. The woke side is really just a product of that awareness. Once you're awake and you begin to see things, once you see things, you can't unsee them anymore. And that's what makes you woke. And faith is wonderful. I mean, I have a lot of faith because I know in my heart that just so many people are listening, and they also know that there is much more to life than just what can be proven by science. It's exciting and at the same time comforting to know that there are mysteries out there that we still need to solve. The answers are out there, and with time, more and more of those answers will be revealed. I know that as though it's a fact, even though I only have my faith to go by. So faith is a really good positive thing, but I am never going to let anyone empty my brain so that they can fill it up with feelings that they want me to have. Feelings that serve their purposes. When I watch a chick flick movie, for example, with cheesy love music, I enjoy it, but I also know it for what it is. And when I hear a speech by someone telling me that someone else is evil or corrupt, well, I don't automatically believe them. I wait to see the evidence. And if there's no evidence, it doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter whether they say that there's evidence. If I haven't seen the evidence, then to be honest, I'm far more likely to believe that the person making the speech is probably corrupt rather than the person that they're accusing. And every time I hear the word woke, I think about Matthew 25 verses 35 to 40. Not because I'm religious, but because whoever that Jesus guy was who said that, he really knew his stuff. I heard something many years ago that stuck with me my entire adult life. I consider it to be the easiest and most direct way to figure a person out. And the saying goes a bit like this. It's really simple. Judge a person by the way he treats someone he doesn't need. That's it. That's my secret when it comes to sussing people out. I don't really care about whether they seem entertaining or funny or kind towards me or complimentary, or whether they're rich or poor or good looking or well educated or maybe just have a PhD in the School of Hard Knocks. I try not to judge people based on those things. Sure, I like the company of people that I have something in common with and who I feel good around, as does everyone else. But I'm talking about really respecting that person and admiring their character. When it comes to that, I like to have a chance to be able to observe them in action around someone or a group of someone's that they have no need for. Because when a person interacts with someone that they don't need, that's when they exhibit their true character, especially if they don't think you're watching at the time. It's for this reason that I've upset a few people on my YouTube channel from time to time, which you might know by now sits in the centre-left area of politics. I've been critical of some of the left-leaning opinion hosts and pundits recently because I can see that when push comes to shove, they might talk a good talk, but they don't go out of their way for someone they can't get something out of. It's very transactional. This is also the case for people on the right as well of the spectrum, so I want to make sure that I've clarified that point as well. It all boils down to this. It really does boil down to this. Nobody needs a stranger who needs help. A person of low character will pass that stranger by and ignore them in their plight. A person of very low character will criticize the stranger or marginalize them or mock them or victimize them, or take advantage of them in their moment of vulnerability, or use them as a political weapon in order to manipulate others. And people of such very low character are the reason for the decline of society, not the strangers in need. And those of faith and intellect, because I really do believe we need both faith and intellect in our lives in order to be whole, well, those people who possess both faith and intellect, well, they will recognize that a stranger in need of help is a chance to prove humanity's worthiness to ascend to a higher place. And that the people who take advantage of those strangers in need or use them as a weapon are the problem in society. The Christians know it, the Gnostics know it, the spiritualists know it. Everybody of good character knows this. And it's good character that builds strong nations with strong populations. Here's another great saying that I like. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Being woke is about making sure that every link in the chain is as strong as it can be, because a strong chain can pull a very heavy load. My name is Ellie. You can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Thank you to everyone who is listening on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you'd like to become a member of the KGRA digital viewing family and hang out with like-minded experiences, spiritualists and weirdos of the best variety like me, whether woke or not, whatever, then go to live.kgradb.com and enter promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.